fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Oh, welcome back into the House of Mystery. And of course, I'm Al Warren. Mr. Michael Hawley is in the room.
Hello, Al. This is going to be a great one.
Yeah, right down your alley, that's for sure.
How coincidental that Monday I have a co-lecture with a local authority on Sherlock Holmes. We're doing Sherlock Holmes versus Jack the Ripper lecture, so I'm excited to talk to Les.
Great. Who's that?
Oh, we have the local authority. His name is Kevin Gallivan.
I have not come across Kevin, but
so I'm going to ask Kevin about Les.
all good. All good.
Get the gossip, you know.
That's right.
Yeah, so I see you're doing a couple of talks. I've noticed because I've shared them, and you're doing a couple of things.
And another one on again Francis Tumbly, who I do, but also it's based on a little bit of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is another reason why I wanted to talk to Les.
Great. Well, Holmes and the Ripper is always a ripe topic. I did a little piece for a magazine that I'm sure you get, Michael, a Ripperologist.
Oh, yes.
I did a little piece a few years ago for them about the Richard Block, Jack the Ripper, Jack el Destripador, which is a great Holmes Ripper crossover.
Oh, that's great, because Adam Wood, who does that Ripperologist, Al and I had actually interviewed just a little bit ago.
It's a hardcore community of scholars. I won't say fans. You can't be fans of Jack.
No.
Oh, we have definitely lots of groups, but like for me, is I love using Ripperologist because when I do my research, I want people to literally rip into it. Just to it's kind of like our peer review in a way. So it works that way.
Well, I always want to plug my dear friend Lindsay Fay's wonderful book, Dust and Shadow, which is the finest of the Holmes meets the Ripper pastiches ever written. If you haven't read it, it's definitely worth reading. She wrote it when she was in her 20s, and I read it for her in manuscript, and I kept saying to myself, I'm going to catch all these mistakes. And wow, she had really done her homework, and it's a terrific book.
What's the name of the book again?
Dust and Shadow.
I've heard of it. I haven't read it, though.
Lindsay Fay.
Writing that one down, Al.
Yeah, write it down. So now the third voice you hear is Mr. Leslie S. Klinger, and he's got a new book out called The New Annotated Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And welcome to the show, of course.
Thank you.
Les, so how did this all happen to you? Like, how did you get involved with this, and you're doing the annotated versions?
Yeah, so when I was in law school, so I'm a lawyer by day, and I keep assuring my wife I'm never going to give up the day job because it's hard to make a living as a writer of the kind of books I do. Well, when I was in law school many years ago, I discovered an amazing book called The Annotated Sherlock Holmes by an author named William S. Baring-Gould. It came out in 1968, and it was put out by Clarkson Potter. It was only really sort of the second big annotated book that sort of hit the public market. The first one was the annotated Alice in Wonderland by Martin Gardner, and then they published Baring-Gould's. And I read the Baring-Gould, and I was fascinated. I had, like many people, I sort of vaguely familiar with Sherlock Holmes. I probably read one or two stories, but I was fascinated not only by the stories, but by the depth of amateur scholarship that was on display in these footnotes, not just by Baring-Gould, but by hundreds of nutcases like me who loved Sherlock Holmes and wanted to do more. So for a long time, I was just a collector, but in the 90s, I decided that I could contribute to the amateur scholarship. And I started writing essays, and then eventually decided that I could re-annotate the stories, that Baring Gould's footnotes, while they were great, were 25, 30 years out of date already at that point. And so I started doing it. I just sort of took it up and I started creating a series of books that later became known as the Sherlock Holmes Reference Library. These were heavily, heavily annotated, footnoted versions of the original stories. A friend of mine called my writing style law review, and it wasn't a compliment. they were talking about sort of, you ever seen a law review, you see a page with a line of text and the entire rest of the page is footnote. And that was my writing. So anyway, I was doing that. And in 2002, I got a call out of the blue from a senior editor at Norton who said, we're going to redo that old Baring Gould book, and we hear you should edit the new edition. It was like, wow, I'm a lawyer, and so I did. I was very fortunate. The book won the Edgar for Best Critical Biographical, and I thought to myself, gee, I must be God's gift to writers. Why have I been holding back all these years? So anyway, I loved the process and the writing community so much that I said, I can do more. So I dove in, and the next book I did was Dracula, and the next book I did after that was loved more and more. There was it became a stream of these heavily annotated texts, all aimed at sort of the popular market, but nonetheless, because I'm not a scholar, I'm not an academic, but there seemed to be an audience for this. So at this point, I've done Sherlock Holmes, which is 3,000 pages, Frankenstein, Dracula, 2 volumes of H.P. Lovecraft. I did the annotated Sandman, which is the brilliant series of graphic novels. I did the annotated Watchmen. I did annotated American Gods, classic American crime fiction of the 1920s. And so now finally, this Jekyll and Hyde. Finally, I don't mean most recently is a better word. Not finally.
Right. Not your last.
Not my last.
How do you go about doing it?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a whole process, but it basically involves reading very slowly. It means looking at the text in such depth that you say to yourself, what does this word mean? What is he talking about here? What is she trying to get across in this sentence? Really parsing out with a fine-tooth comb the choice of words, the absurdities in the action, historical references, cultural references, social references. And then, I mean, I always say, look, these are great books. They don't need Les Klinger to be great books. My idea is to try and enhance the reader's experience, sort of like the director's track on a DVD or something. Not that I'm the director, but I mean, to give the reader a supplement, more about the things they're reading. And it started out for me, I was one of these people who talked to the screen in the movie theater. That's great. Look at that scene. Oh, this is just like that over there. And drove my wife crazy. So I channeled those bad urges into more socially acceptable channels.
Do you find you have to be kind of careful on how you do that and kind of what?
Well, in theaters, yes. I try not to annoy the patient.
Well, yeah.
But no, there is a selectivity. Many of the books that I have annotated are books where somebody else has done it before me, either an academic or in some cases early popular editions. There was a writer named Leonard Wolfe who did an annotated Dracula. He did an annotated Frankenstein, and I think he even did annotated Jekyll and Hyde many years ago, back in the 70s. And so I want to look at what those other writers did. And generally, if they wrote a footnote about it, I probably want to write a footnote about it too. But not always. I try to be selective. Baring Gould, for example, was fascinated in the Sherlock Holmes stories with the subject known to Sherlockians as chronology, meaning when did the events described in this story actually take place? I do spend some time on that with some of these things, but I try not to be obsessed with it as Baring Gould was. So, for example, Dracula. There's a real question about when did the events in the story take place? It's very specific about dates, but the dates don't quite work on a calendar, and so on. So there's all kinds of sort of sub-subjects. Language. I mean, when you're doing Victorian books, Michael, as a ripperologist, I know you know this. We don't speak Victorian English.
Oh, for sure.
There are so many phrases and words that meant something different then, and social customs that were just different then. For example, there's a scene in Frankenstein where in Dracula, where Lucy leaves her visiting card at somebody's house. What does that mean? We don't do that anymore. It was a thing. You left a calling card at somebody's house saying you'd been there.
One of the things I wanted to try to do on my fiction novel that I wrote called The Ripper's Hellbroth about Jack the Ripper, I was looking for 19th century jokes, and 99.9% of them we can't use today because, boy, do they rip on the Irish. They rip on everyone. It's just so... Well, that was inappropriate. Can't do that one.
Well, you got to look hard. There's one of my favorite illustrations that I've forgotten which book I put it in. It may have been Sherlock Holmes. I'm trying to remember the relevance, but it shows an older woman walking on the street. She's talking to her girlfriend, and she's all covered with bandages and bruises and a black eye. And one of them says, Joe's home from work again. And it's about violence against women, domestic abuse, but it was, and of course the prevalence of alcohol and drunkenness in lower class society in England. They poked fun at themselves. They made fun of it. It's not so funny anymore, but.
Right. And then even with the unfortunates, they used to say, you want to do the business. Although then when you watch some movies, I just watched one Sherlock Holmes versus Jack the Ripper on TV called something Terror.
A Study in Terror, my favorite Sherlock Holmes movie.
Oh, okay. And then I just remember when one of the unfortunates said something else, and I thought, that's not what they mean.
Right. Well, it's partly about prostitution. So there's that's such a great movie. John Neville plays Holmes. Donald Houston plays Watson. It's got the wonderful Anthony Quayle in it. And best of all, it has Robert Morley playing the part of Mycroft Holmes, Sherlock's older brother.
Oh, yeah.
Who is the spitting image of Mycroft from the Sidney Paget illustration. So, and there's also, by the way, a very good book. It was novelized by Ellery Queen. So watch for it. Study in Terror.
Study in Terror. I'll look for that too. But it was so funny. I just watched that, and then we'll get to interview Les, and then I get to talk to more about Sherlock Holmes and stuff. So it's interesting.
What do you think well, actually, before I get into that, do you learn something each time you do one of these books?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I have started some of the books. I mean, Sherlock Holmes and Dracula, I had spent a lot of time with before I began annotating them. The other books I had read once. And so when you go back to them and annotate, I mean, one of the warnings, one of the bits of advice I give to writers who think they're going to write a book, that doesn't have to be annotated, but a book about another book, is you better really like that book because you're going to spend a lot of time with it. and the pleasure, the joy of doing something like Jekyll and Hyde is how brilliant it is. This is a book that we'll talk about in a few minutes. I'm sure we'll talk about movies of the book and all that. But this is a book that's been adapted many, many times, and like Frankenstein or Dracula, therefore, it's one of these stories that everybody thinks they know until they read the book, and then they say, "Oh, this is considerably different." So one of the great pleasures of doing Jekyll and Hyde was reminding myself, I'd like to think, of the incredibly meticulous craftsmanship that Stevenson used in creating this story. It's got a shocking ending. This is a story that was described by one critic as a mystery in which the solution is more shocking than the crime. And when you read it, knowing when you know the ending, when you sort of know the surprise and you go back and read it again, one of the things that I saw and learned was just how beautifully crafted it is with its buildup of clues, hints, and suspense in getting toward that ending. That it's all there, but as you're reading it for the first time, it's this great mystery.
It's kind of strange. What do you think the fascination is with some of these stories that stay around years and years, and they keep coming back and keep coming back? What is it? Is it the detail in the writing? Is it what is it that?
I think it's a combination of things. Of course, part of it. I mean, there is a certain element of nostalgia for the Victorian age. Or sort of invented nostalgia, because none of us really remember Victoriana. But we have this vague idea that it was a golden age. And so reading these, I mean, Michael, certainly you know better. If you studied the Ripper at all, you really studied the incredibly ugly side of life in the big cities.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
Alcohol and abuse and crime.
Tale of Two Cities with London.
Yeah. So nostalgia is a small part of it. I think in each of these, it's the plasticity, if you will. It's the iconic nature of the central characters or the stories. So we can talk for hours about Sherlock Holmes and why people admire or want to be Sherlock Holmes or want to be like Sherlock Holmes. That's a whole deep discussion. But jumping to the others, I mean, we're fascinated by a figure like Dracula or a figure like the creature in Frankenstein, outside of society and yet very much part of society, and therefore giving the writer the ability to comment on society. But there's also a certain immortality to these characters. The things that they're about are timeless. Jekyll and Hyde is a timeless story about hypocrisy, about what Stevenson called the war, that old war of the members. That is to say, the dueling nature of human beings, that we all have our Jekylls and our Hydes inside us and struggle to reconcile them. It's not a story that is in any way locked into Victorian England. You can move it just like you can with Holmes and Dracula and Frankenstein and all those. You can pick it up and move it to any time and it works. And that timelessness, that depth, I think, is what makes these books, it's why they endure, because they are so plastic and can be molded to fit any time or place.
The Mansfield's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde performed right at the beginning of the Ripper murders. As a matter of fact, the first day it performed, it was August 4th. August 5th it made the papers, and August 6th is when arguably the first Ripper murder occurred. Yes. And then no one knows this, what I just found out. It's going to be part of my next book, is that the very first time at the Lyceum Theater, when they canceled the show 4 hours later was the double event murder where two women were murdered. So, but then they kind of continued the show afterwards, but the public thought it was done. So here is, if Jack the Ripper was this person looking for this elixir, that would have been inspiration. And then next thing you know, he would have been quite upset that, the show was canceled.
Right. He was a pissed off theater goer.
Exactly.
His ticket was canceled. So no, it's remarkable coincidences here. And of course, that era is also Dracula's time.
Oh yeah. Bram Stoker was
very much an overlap of the exact time periods. We could go, Dracula and the Ripper is a whole other deep subject. So, that's
what the Ripper's haunt is actually about, because Bram Stoker was at the Lyceum Theater when he was a business manager, and his best pal was Henry Hall Caine, who was the boyfriend of the guy I researched, Tumblebee. So it's a lot, definitely.
Yes. Well, they all knew each other. It was a small circle of literary friends and colleagues. I mean, Conan Doyle knew Stoker, and they just were, it was a small group of people. Stevenson knew them all too.
Wow.
So this is a time, I mean, there's no question in my mind that Stevenson very much wanted to explore the hypocrisy of the era as well. But this is a time when, we sort of put ourselves back into Victorian times, when there was a great deal of stress on propriety, outwardly proper living. At the same time, there was a great deal of private sinning going on. This was the time of the great scandals of child prostitution rings.
Oh, yes.
Of course, homosexuality was a crime.
Gross indecency, yes.
Right. And there were prosecutions. This is Oscar Wilde time. And so it's interesting that people think of Mr. Hyde as this evil, vicious creature. We're not sure what sins he's committing other than a murder. I mean, we definitely know he commits a murder. But what else is he doing? And what is it that Dr. Jekyll is covering up? What is it that he is deeply repenting from his past? Was it homosexuality? Was it hanging out with prostitutes? This is an unusual book, and it's deliberately ambiguous. But of course, as you've pointed out, Michael, the public reacted to it immediately, and there were sermons all over the place about this book and the wages of sin.
Question then, with both that and Dracula's, there's been people that believe there's codes in there. How's your take on that?
You mean secret messages?
Kind of like what they're talking about, maybe possibly is actual person, actual events that are happening. Kind of.
Yeah. Well, I haven't seen any. I mean, certainly there were historical figures that inspired Stevenson. One of them is a man named Deacon Brodie. This was a figure about whom Stevenson and his friend William Henley actually wrote a play. Deacon Brodie was a man who led a very respectable life by day. He was a deacon of the church, and by night was the leader of a gang of thieves, and eventually caught and exposed. And that dual life, that hypocrisy, fascinated Stevenson. And I think Stevenson also felt that he himself was a hypocrite. He had been expected by his family to become an architect, and to lead a sort of suitably professional class life in London, but he really wanted to be an artist. And of course, he ended up bailing on England altogether and moving to the South Pacific. So it was partly about himself, but I don't know that he had a very specific person in mind. Unlike Frankenstein, where we can point to sort of scientists of the day who were interested in the creation of life, I'm not aware of any specific science that was undertaken here that had to do with the kind of things that Jekyll and Hyde is about. There was interest in split personalities. There was already some case reports of people with split personalities. There were psychological problems, not just the Deacon Brodie who was getting away with two lies.
That's pretty fascinating because there's so much, I guess, kind of hidden meaning to the book, or there's so many different ways to look at it. You must really have to think about this. And
well, you think about it and you read a lot. I mean, as I said, I started this out sort of saying, yeah, that's really a good book. I'll bet I can do something interesting with it. And then dove into the scholarship, the research, the work that others have done. I don't think of myself as a particularly creative person when I do these books. I think of myself as someone who can appreciate other people's work and try and sort of put it on display and reference a lot. So, for example, when I did the stories of H.P. Lovecraft, I did 2 volumes of Lovecraft. There's a huge amount of scholarship that I read through and tried to pull into references in the work to show what other people had done and what they had thought about many, many issues.
And you must really have to, like when you're doing like this book, Jekyll and Hyde here, you must really have to find out about Stevenson, like so much that was going on during the time he wrote it, like, you know.
Yes. Yeah. Well, so again, this is the Victorian period, so it's one that I felt pretty comfortable with. I have a depth of research material in the form of, I have an 1888 Britannica, I have a 1910 Britannica, I have a whole slew of Baedekers from the time period, travel guides. I have slang dictionaries, I have almanacs and medical texts and so on. So I love using those Victorian resources. Plus the internet has a tremendous amount of Victorian material available in the form of magazines, journals that were being published at the time, and books that are long out of print.
So what do you think about the movie adaptations of these sort of things, or the way that it goes to screen? I know I was recently listening to Frankenstein on audiobook, and that was the first time for me, and I was surprised at how much more there was to the book. I almost thought when I was listening, maybe I was listening to the wrong book. It's so different from what I grew up with. And it's like, wow, that's crazy. I mean, that must be work in itself to take something like this and turn it into a movie.
Right. Well, so this happened. Frankenstein is a perfect example of this, and it happened again with the Jekyll and Hyde, which is that the book so caught the public attention that it was immediately and illegally, because copyright laws were pretty loose, put on the stage. And because it was the stage, it had to be, and we'll get to film in a minute, but film had the same issues. It had to be considerably simplified and, if you will, sort of focused, sharpened to be sort of one note. And in most cases, there had to be a romantic element introduced because that would be more appealing to an audience. So all of the adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde are distortions of the original story. Because it's just sort of the nature of, we'll say that's Hollywood. You know, that's what happens when you make stage plays or movies out of a book where you can indulge in a lot of subtlety. So all of the stage plays have romantic interests, whereas the book has essentially no women in it. There's one minor woman character in the story, but everybody of any importance is a man. And that doesn't play well on the screen. Hollywood wouldn't buy that version. So it got changed. And similarly, Dr. Jekyll becomes much more heroic, much more the victim than the book would credit him with. Similarly to Dr. Frankenstein. When you read Frankenstein, I'm sure you came to the conclusion that the real villain of that story is not the creature, it's Victor Frankenstein, who is a really awful father. And that is not the message of the stage plays, which focus on, oh, he went too far as a scientist. He explored things. The title of the first stage play of Frankenstein was called Presumption, which says it all. It's sort of be careful what you research. And similarly, Jekyll and Hyde got into much the same sort of vein. It was, oh, poor Dr. Jekyll, he investigated things that he shouldn't have, and he let loose a monster. Well, that's not the theme of the book at all. The theme of the book is, this is the real Hyde. This is real parts of Dr. Jekyll. As G.K. Chesterton said, the great revelation of the book is not that Jekyll is two people. It's that Jekyll and Hyde are one person. So Jekyll becomes all good in the stage and screen versions, as opposed to being a normal human being with a lot of good parts and a lot of bad parts, as he's depicted in the book.
Do you think there was a political motivation to it, relating to the times?
Sure. It was also about the hypocrisy of the politicians and the people running the government, espousing great ideals and living lives that were secretly sinful.
Thank God that's changed.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I'll tell you, it has changed. It has changed considerably. Now everybody says, yeah, I'm an awful person. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Yeah, no, it's funny. It's just, do you think the writing was better back then?
No, but I don't think it was better. I think there's some wonderful writers now, but I guess I would say that there was more attention paid to writing because, we have to keep reminding ourselves, this is before radio, before television, before movies. So the only entertainment venue out there was basically books or the stage, which is like books in that it sort of was all about the script. And so there was more interest in writing. This was a golden age for writers and readers, because of several developments. Because of, number one, the board schools, more and more education for the poor and the middle classes, and a lot of spread of reading. I mean, reading in the 18th century, remember, was a pastime of the aristocratic classes. They're the only ones that knew how to read. Nobody else could read. So books were a luxury. But when we get to the 19th century, we have the spread of education, and we have more leisure time because of the railroads. We have people spending a lot of time twiddling their thumbs while they're on the train, riding to or from the city or their other place of employment. And so they bought magazines and newspapers and read and read and read. So it was a golden age for writers and readers, I think.
When someone was going to read and even read a paper, they, from my understanding, they would read page to page in every single article. Like, it was very, like, people devour it. They really got into it.
Yes.
Like, it's not like someone today sitting on the train and flipping through the New York Times. It was, yeah.
That's right. It was their entertainment. They couldn't text people. They didn't have things to watch on their phones. They didn't have movies or radio or television. So they read, and they wanted to be entertained. I mean, we've forgotten, I think, that many of the great novels of the 19th century were published serially in newspapers. And so people's attention had to be grabbed so they'd buy the next issue.
Would you want to live back in those times?
Oh, no. I think that, on the one hand, the Victorian age is fascinating to me because I like to say every revolution of the 20th century really was born then, whether we're talking about the rights of women, people of color, the Industrial Revolution, the Communications Revolution, computers, the explosion of science, all of that started in the 19th century. But we've also forgotten that London was a town filled with smoke and haze and horse manure.
One of the things I talk about there is that because of the prevailing westerly winds, the wealthy were on the West End where they would get the winds from the countryside, the fresh air, and the East End, which was older, they got all that stuff you were just talking about.
It was an odoriferous time in London. We take all our modern conveniences for granted, whether it's the water closet or the running hot and cold water and all that, and the gas range, electric lights. There were a lot of sort of hardships, or at least what we would regard today as hardships, of living in that time. It was not a good time to be a woman or a person of color. It was not a good time to be poor. Life was a struggle. On the other hand, every middle class household had a maid, because you just had to, and they were plentiful. All those young Irish girls.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest things people miss out on that time when they talk about, how good the times were back then. But they're not actually thinking about the person's day-to-day life, what they actually had to do just to get through the day.
Right. Well, just dressing alone. My goodness, the amount of clothing that especially women had to wear. And the efforts that they went to and the rigid constraints on things like mourning, and dating and employment. It was a restrictive time. It was also not a great time to be living in one of the colonies of the empire, although people like to think of that as a golden age too. Not if you were living in India or Ireland or any of the other many colonies. The United States was no longer a colony. But it was a time when it was great if you were one of the rulers, but not so great if you were one of the colonials.
Including disease. That was quite a situation.
Yes.
Well, grooming's got to have been really difficult too back then.
That's right. Shaving a haircut was a lot more effort. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it wasn't like you couldn't daily groom like we do now. What a different time. What do you hope people get out of this? Like when you do something like this at the end of it, like when someone picks this up and looks at it, and I see there's going to be over 100 color.
Oh, absolutely. Well. And the images are great. I hope they walk away saying, gee, I didn't realize what a great book this really was. And not because Les Klinger is trumpeting it. That's not what I mean. What I mean is I hope they will walk away having discovered aspects of the story that they had no idea were there, and walk away applauding Robert Louis Stevenson and the work of genius that he created, that otherwise they may not have paid attention to.
I wonder what it was that particularly made certain one of these. Was this Stevenson's only book?
Oh, not at all.
No.
He was already known as a writer of works like Treasure Island, and Kidnapped, and many other sort of adventure stories. He became, later scholars thought of him as just a children's author, but later scholars went back and read his other stuff and said, well, he had a lot of adult material that was pretty darn good. No, this was not his first book nor his best known book. And in fact, it was just sort of tossed off. He only took 6 weeks to write it. And I'm not sure it's his prime. I think probably he's best remembered for Treasure Island. these days rather than Jekyll and Hyde. But and while Treasure Island is a great book and one that fascinates me, it's not one that I wanted to particularly spend a lot of time with.
I'm still intrigued by 1886 when that came out, and then 2 years later, the Whitechapel murders occurred, and there was so much connection to that because, especially when they were thinking that Jack the Ripper was a Jekyll Hyde type person, where during the day he was a prominent physician, at night he was a medical maniac, maybe looking for the elixir of life. And then, so I mean, it's just like they fed off each other, and I'm wondering maybe even Jack the Ripper exploited that. So
who knows? A copycat, maybe. Although we don't know much about the murder that takes place with Jack the Ripper, just that he murdered this guy. And it's such a weird story that Sir Danvers was out posting a letter at 1 a.m, and he meets Hyde, and Hyde kills him in a fit of something, rage, who knows. But the murder is so sort of inexplicable. You get the feeling that it's really secret code for something else, that it was a homosexual assignation that went wrong or something like that. And of course, I think there were a lot of those. I think there was a lot of that sort of thing actually happening. And so I think the idea of that sort of late night violence was not strange to the reading public. And so was the Ripper a copycat? I don't know. Could be.
Well, interestingly, that Martha Tabram, who was murdered on August 6th, that was the 1 year anniversary of the execution of Henry Pranzini, who was a Paris Ripper that cut the throat of 3 women. And so that was the 1 year anniversary of that. So of his execution. So, and it definitely, Jack the Ripper could be a Pranzini copycat too. So, and here it is. At that time, right there, especially if you have Bram Stoker's Dracula, what a kind of a mix.
Absolutely. It's Dracula. I believe Dracula took place in 1888. I'm not wholly alone in that view, but it's not the popular view. Most people subscribe to the view it was 1893, but I believe it was 1888, smack in the middle of Ripper time. When you look at a map of where Dracula had 11 spots around London where he kept boxes of soil. If you map those out, it's exactly where the Ripper murders took place.
So is it true then that Bram Stoker dedicated the book to Henry Hall Caine, who in fact was a boyfriend, one of the top Ripper suspects?
It is true. They were friends. So they were longtime friends. I don't know that he knew about the Ripper connection, but
well, I do know that Bram Stoker at the Lyceum Theater, the Order of the Golden Dawn was started in 1888. And one of their goals was to look for the Philosopher's Stone or the elixir of life, and how coincidental that these vampires are immortal, and so it's so intriguing. It's just fun. I mean, you know how many conspiracies
I know. It's a wonderful stew. So the writer who has mixed this stew best is my friend Kim Newman. If you haven't read his Anno Dracula series, it's brilliant. And it has the Ripper very much in it. Anno Dracula, and there's actually 4 or 5 novels in the series now, but the first of them is called Anno Dracula, one of the finest vampire novels ever written. And Dr. Seward plays a material part in it, and I don't want to give anything away, but let me just say the Ripper is very much involved in the story. So it's about, he basically imagines that the hunters, the crew of light of Dracula, failed. Dracula survived. He's in England. He actually ends up marrying Queen Victoria and becoming he is nobility, remember, he is a count. So he ends up being sort of the ruler of England through Victoria, who becomes essentially his sort of slave. and it's a terrific book, very popular, and Kim Newman. So
That's a heck of a royal conspiracy,
yes.
then.
Yeah. Yeah, Neil Story has quite a bit to say about that too. We've talked to him a few times about, this whole combination of people and stuff. It's just really bizarre.
And the Sikh, it's sort of things get weird. Remember how we all thought what we thought was going to happen in the end times of 1999? It was all happening in 1899 and the decade before that.
So what's up for you next? Are you gonna? You must do like one every couple of years or something. It must take.
Yes, I haven't agreed with the publisher on the next title yet. We've been kicking around some ideas. Probably it'll be The Invisible Man. But meanwhile, I am continuing to be busy with the Library of Congress Crime Classics series. We put out one of those essentially every 3 months. Those are lightly annotated editions of American crime classics. I just finished doing my annotations for S.S. Van Dyne's The Canary Murder Case, which is 1930, 1929. Philo Vance, the great detective Philo Vance. We've done earlier stuff, and we've done later stuff. So it's a real mix, and it's a lot of fun to do those sort of in between the big books.
Yeah, it must be. So how do you like people to find you? Are you doing a website, social media?
Yes, there's all of the above. There's a website, lesliesklinger.com, which shows all my books, and you can order them there if you are so moved. I'm on Twitter under the clever title of L. Klinger. Please look for me on social media and reach out. And I love, as you can tell, I love talking about these things.
Well, we'll have that on our website as well, so people can find you with one click. And that. How was the pandemic for this type of research and work for you?
First of all, lawyers generally, I think, were super busy during the pandemic. I mean, it was not a problem to not come in the office. I was able to get a tremendous amount of work done at home. So it didn't really affect my writing at all. It only affected my ability to go to conventions and see my friends. But I was able to devote a lot of time to writing, but the same as before.
Yeah. Do you think that, something like the pandemic that happens and the people that live through it and the writers that live through it, do you think it'll influence how they write in? And so,
Absolutely.
And in that same kind of line, when these books were being written, like Jekyll and Hyde and Frankenstein and Dracula and stuff, how much of that time's issues would have affected what they wrote? Do you think it kind of seeps in somehow?
Absolutely. And I think part of it's intentional. One of the great things about crime writing, I've always said, is that by the very nature of the subject matter, it allows us to explore the dark side of contemporary life. And I think the same was true of the kind of genre fiction that was being written in the 19th century, whether it was about monsters or crimes or even the supernatural. It allowed those writers to write about their own societies and criticize them without it being a social, without it being simply a social critique. I mean, nobody wanted to just write an essay about what's wrong with modern London. They could do it better by telling a story that showed what was wrong with modern London. So I think that's always been true for writers, that telling stories is a way to talk about the world out there. And it's never been about just pure entertainment for the great writers.
Right. There's always a subtext. There's always something that they want people to pick up.
That's right. And whether it's intentional or not. I mean, when you write a story about, Tess of the D'Urberville, You are writing about a social problem, something that is really bothering you, because that's what makes an interesting story. It's not much of a story to write about Les Klinger and his life practicing law. People say to me, "Why don't you write something about it?" Well, because I won't say it's a boring life. It's just not a life that has a story that anybody else would want to read.
You don't have a Mr. Hyde side that...
Well,
Oh,
not
yeah.
that I'm gonna tell you.
Yeah, well, you see, this is what we got to get on paper.
Right. The Mr. Hyde side for me is my writing life.
Yeah,
Yes.
well, there you go. Well, what did you find out about Robert Louis Stevenson that you didn't know, or was there any surprises?
Yeah, I didn't really understand that he was this, as I said earlier, that he was also a conflicted person who basically struggled with reconciling the expectations of his family with his own personal interests of being an artist. I didn't really know that about him at all. So that was a revelation, and it's all there in the stories. Once you know that, you start to see that was part of his subtext, if you will.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing what you can pick up about people, about writers, if you
It's
really...
like Lovecraft. One of my editors said to me, "Wow, when I read your introduction about Lovecraft, has written these stories that are so weird. And when you find out that his biography is that both of his parents died in the insane asylum,"
Oh boy.
it becomes like, yeah, wow, that explains a lot.
Well, this has been a great show. I find you very interesting, and of course, the new book is the new annotated Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and of course, our guest is the author of that, Leslie S. Klinger. Thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure, Alan.
It's great speaking with you, Les.
Same here, Michael. Good luck with your Ripper talk here. So.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or show, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me? Well, good night. This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.